Somewhere in the 9th century, the people who lived along the shores of the Mediterranean woke up to a problem they had not anticipated. The longships had arrived. Not in the grey northern waters where they belonged, not in the fog-wrapped channels of Frisia or the river mouths of Francia, but here, in the inland sea, in waters that had known Phoenician traders and Roman war galleys and Arab corsairs, but had never, until now, known the sound of Viking oars. It is one of history's stranger surprises. We tend to think of the Vikings in a particular geography: Scandinavia, the North Sea, the British Isles, the rivers of Ireland. That picture is accurate, but it is radically incomplete, because the same people who raided Lindisfarne and settled Iceland also navigated their way to Sicily. They appeared at the walls of Constantinople, more than once. They carried their swords all the way to Jerusalem, and when they finally settled down long enough to leave a lasting mark, they did it by carving their names into the marble of one of the most magnificent buildings the world has ever produced. How did they get there? That is the question this video is built around. Not in a vague sense, but specifically, what routes did Scandinavians follow to reach the Mediterranean world? What did they do when they arrived? And what did the experience leave behind? In the historical record, in the stones and runestones, and in the cultures that still carry faint traces of that contact today. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet. The story moves along 3 distinct pathways, and each one tells you something different about who the Vikings were and what they wanted. The first is raiding, pure, violent, and spectacular. Longships penetrating deep into Mediterranean waters, striking coasts that had no framework for understanding what had just appeared on the horizon. The second is trade and river travel, which is quieter and arguably more consequential. Vikings, or rather the Rus as the Scandinavians who settled the river systems of Eastern Europe came to be called, built an entire commercial world by threading together the rivers of Russia and Ukraine, portaging between watersheds, and eventually pouring out into the Black Sea and down to the doorstep of Constantinople. The third pathway is mercenary service. Vikings became soldiers for hire inside the Byzantine Empire, fighting under Roman commanders in places as far-flung as Sicily and Anatolia, and doing it so effectively that the emperors eventually decided to make them a permanent institution. These 3 pathways overlap and feed into each other, which is part of what makes the story so rich. A raider in one generation becomes a trader in the next, and a trader's grandson might die in Byzantine service somewhere on the Italian coast. The geography that holds it all together is an extraordinary chain of waters: the Baltic, the rivers of Eastern Europe, the Black Sea, the Bosporus, the Aegean, and finally the Levant. No single ship travelled all of it at once, but collectively, across roughly 2.5 centuries, Norse ships touched every part of that chain. This is fundamentally a maritime story, and like all maritime stories, it lives at the intersection of distance and ambition. The question of how far a wooden hull and a square sail and an extraordinarily determined crew can actually go. There is one more thing worth establishing at the outset, and it runs through the entire narrative like a fault line. This is a story where legend and evidence are in constant tension. Some of what the medieval sources tell us is backed by archaeology, by Byzantine chronicles, by the physical marks Vikings left on stone and marble. Some of it is not. There is a famous account of a massive Viking fleet attacking Constantinople in 907, ships supposedly hauled overland on wheels to bypass the Great Chain the Byzantines had stretched across the Golden Horn. It makes for a magnificent story. But Byzantine sources say nothing about it, which is a significant silence, and modern historians treat the account with considerable caution. It may be a later invention constructed to explain trade treaties that actually came about through different means. Similarly, the chronicles give us fleet sizes that strain credibility. Hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of warriors, and while these numbers almost certainly reflect real events of real scale, the exact figures should be held loosely. Medieval chroniclers were not admiralty clerks. They were often writing decades after the fact, with political and theological agendas that shaped what they recorded and how they recorded it. None of this makes the history less interesting. If anything, it makes it more interesting, because it means we have to read carefully, triangulate between sources, and pay close attention to the physical evidence. The runic graffiti scratched into the marble of Hagia Sophia, the lion at the entrance to the Venetian arsenal, that still carries Viking runes on its flank, the runestones back in Sweden commemorating men who died in Greece and never came home. The gap between what the sagas claim and what we can actually verify is itself part of the story. It tells us something about how Viking culture processed these extraordinary journeys, how they became legend, how they were transmitted, how they eventually hardened into the kind of source material that historians have been arguing about ever since. So, a fleet appears in waters it has no business being in. The people on shore look out at the unfamiliar silhouettes and try to make sense of what they're seeing. We are going to trace how those ships got there, beginning with the world they came from and the pressures that pushed them south. To understand why Vikings pushed so far from home, you have to start with the fundamental contrast between the world they knew and the world they were beginning to hear about. Scandinavia in the 9th century was not a poor society. It was a sophisticated one, with skilled metalworkers, experienced sailors, and complex political structures. But its material wealth had limits that were difficult to ignore once the alternatives became visible. Furs, timber, amber, iron. These were the goods the North produced in abundance. They were valuable. They were not, however, silk. Byzantine silk was not simply expensive fabric. It was a statement about the nature of the world. The Byzantine Empire controlled the production, distribution, and symbolic weight of silk in a way that made it simultaneously a luxury good, a diplomatic currency, and a marker of civilization itself. Gold coins flowed through Constantinople in quantities that had no equivalent anywhere in the Norse world, and from the markets of the Arab caliphates came something even more practically useful to a Viking trader: silver. Islamic dirhams, minted in enormous quantities, were circulating through the medieval world as a kind of international currency. They ended up everywhere, and archaeologists have found proof of just how far they travelled. The Spillings hoard, discovered on the Swedish island of Gotland, contained more than 14,000 individual Arabic silver coins, weighing around 67 kilograms in total. One hoard, in one location, tells you everything you need to know about the scale of appetite the Norse world had developed for southern wealth. That appetite was not new. What was new in the mid-9th century was the emergence of a systematic answer to it. The answer came from a particular group of Scandinavians, predominantly Swedish, who had been pushing east and south along the river systems of Eastern Europe. These were the people who would come to be known as the Rus, a name whose exact origin is still debated, but whose legacy is embedded in the name Russia itself. The Rus were not a separate people from the Vikings in any meaningful biological or cultural sense. They were Norsemen who had crossed the Baltic, established trading posts in what is now northwestern Russia, and then followed the rivers deeper into the continent. The Volkhov, the Dnieper, the Volga. These were not simply rivers to the Rus. They were highways, and the Rus understood them with the same intimacy that their cousins understood the North Sea. By threading these river systems together, and by portaging their boats across the watersheds that separated one drainage basin from another, the Rus created a corridor that connected the Baltic to the Black Sea. At the southern end of that corridor sat Constantinople, Miklagard, the great city as the Norse called it. The translation is roughly the Great Enclosure, and it captures something of the awe the place inspired. No city in Scandinavia, no settlement anywhere in the Norse world came close to it in scale, in wealth, or in the sheer density of the things worth acquiring. What flowed north through this corridor was transformative. Silk, purchased in Byzantine markets, travelled up the Dnieper and into the Baltic world. Gold coins appeared in Norse graves. Arab silver accumulated in hoards across Sweden, Norway and Denmark. Archaeological research has made clear that most of the silk reaching the Viking world arrived via these eastern routes, through Byzantium and Persia, carried along the rivers the Rus controlled. The Rus were not just geographically convenient middlemen, they were the architects of a commercial system. But commerce alone does not fully explain the pull of the south. The Vikings were also political creatures, alert to opportunity in the form of instability, conflict, and the needs of powerful rulers. A Byzantine emperor who needed soldiers had gold to pay them with. An Arab market that needed furs could offer silver in return. The same skills that made a longship crew dangerous in a raid made them valuable as mercenaries, as bodyguards, as river escorts for merchant convoys. Viking identity was always more fluid than the popular image suggests. Raider and trader were often the same person in different seasons, and the mercenary was simply the next logical step. What begins, then, as a straightforward story of greed, and there is no point being coy about the fact that wealth was the primary driver, gradually deepens into something more complex. The economic logic of the Rus trade routes created relationships that lasted generations. A man who went south to take silver sometimes stayed south to earn it, and his children might grow up speaking Greek or Arabic alongside Norse. The raid was a moment. The trade relationship was a structure, and structures once built tend to outlast the individuals who built them. Picture a Norseman standing on the shore of Lake Ladoga in early spring, when the ice has just broken and the water runs fast and cold. Behind him, the Gulf of Finland and the open Baltic. Ahead, a river system that he cannot see to the end of, not because it disappears into the horizon, but because it disappears into a continent. He is not lost. He has done this before, or his father has, or the men at the trading post at Staraya Ladoga have told him exactly what to expect. The route is known. That is the remarkable thing. By the mid-9th century, Norsemen had mapped these rivers not with parchment and ink, but with the accumulated knowledge of generations of traders, explorers and survivors, and what they had mapped was a corridor that ran from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, from the Norse world to the edge of Byzantium. The journey began in Scandinavia's own waters. Ships loaded in Birka on Lake Mälaren or at Hedeby near the base of the Danish peninsula, or at one of the Baltic ports on Gotland, would cross the open sea to the Gulf of Finland. From there the route turned inland, pushing up the Neva River into Lake Ladoga, the largest lake in Europe, cold and wide and capable of producing storms that could destroy an unwary crew. At the lake's southern end sat Staraya Ladoga, one of the earliest and most important Norse settlements in the east, a place where Scandinavian merchants had been trading since at least the 8th century. From Staraya Ladoga, the Volkhov River carried the traveller south to Novgorod, Aldiguborg in Old Norse, which had grown by the late 9th century into the critical junction of the entire network. Here the Baltic, the Volga and the Dnieper routes converged, and here the decisions were made about which direction a crew would take. Those two great southward routes were distinct in their destinations and their character. The Volga route branched east and then south. After Novgorod and Lake Ilmen, traders hauled their boats approximately 3 kilometers overland to reach the sources of the Volga. A short enough portage in theory, though moving a loaded longship even a short distance over broken forest terrain was an exercise in exhausting coordinated labour. Once on the Volga, the journey became a long, gradual descent through the lands of the Volga Bulgars, and eventually past the Khazar capital of Atil to the Caspian Sea. This was the route to the Arab world, to the markets where Islamic silver dirhams were available in quantities that seem almost unimaginable until you start finding the hoards. The earliest concentrations of Arabic coins in Europe have been dated to around 804 and 805, and they were found along this Volga corridor, physical proof that the route was already functioning at commercial scale before the 9th century had properly begun. The other route, the one that led ultimately to Constantinople, followed the Dnieper. From Lake Ilmen, the path went up the Lovat River, then crossed a portage, again through forested, often hostile territory, to the western Dvina, down the Kasplia, and across another overland haul to reach the Katinka, a tributary that fed into the Dnieper itself. Once on the Dnieper, the traveller was committed to a long journey south through what is now Ukraine, past the growing settlement of Kiev and eventually out into the Black Sea. The exact locations of some of these portage crossings are still debated by historians, the medieval sources imprecise and the modern landscape transformed, but the general shape of the route is clear, and the sheer number of Norse artefacts found along it confirms that it was travelled by thousands of people over several centuries. The Dnieper was not a gentle road. Somewhere in its middle course the river narrowed and dropped through a series of rapids, 7 of them, cascading approximately 50 metres over a distance of 66 kilometres. Byzantine sources describe this stretch in some detail, and what they describe is dangerous. Norse crews had to unload their ships, carry everything overland, drag or carry the vessels themselves along the bank, and reload on the far side, all while watching for the Pechenegs, the nomadic steppe warriors who understood perfectly well that a Norse crew struggling with a portage was a Norse crew that could not fight back effectively. Some ships were sunk in the rapids, some crews were ambushed and killed. The Dnieper's lower course was the most hazardous stretch of the entire route from Baltic to Black Sea, and it had to be run every time. And yet it was run, reliably, season after season. The risk was accepted because the reward waiting at the end of it was unlike anything the northern world could offer. Kiev, growing at the river's great bend, became the principal market for the goods the Norse brought south. Furs from the forests of the far north, amber from the Baltic coast, honey, wax, and the bleakest commodity of all, slaves. Human beings captured in raids across Eastern Europe were carried down the Dnieper and sold in markets that stretched from Kiev to Constantinople to the caliphates of the Arab world. It is uncomfortable, and it should be, because the slave trade was not peripheral to these networks, it was structural. What came back in return for these exports was the material transformation of the Norse world. Arab silver dirhams flowed north in volumes that have left their trace in hundreds of archaeological hoards across Scandinavia. Byzantine silk, traded in Constantinople's regulated markets, travelled up the Dnieper and eventually appeared in the graves of Norse aristocrats who had never left Scandinavia. Glass, luxury metalwork, and prestige objects of every kind made the same journey. The river routes did not merely connect markets, they redistributed culture, and along these routes the Rus centres grew. Novgorod was the great northern hub, the place where a traveller from the Baltic world first encountered the logic of the river system and made his choices. Kiev was the southern hub, where the Norse presence blended with Slavic populations and Byzantine influence to produce something genuinely new, a political entity that was neither Scandinavian nor Eastern European in the old sense, but something emerging from the contact between both. The Rus who settled at Kiev were, within 2 or 3 generations, speaking Slavic languages and adopting local customs, while still maintaining the trade connections and sometimes the martial culture of their Norse origins. Identity along these rivers was not fixed. It was negotiated constantly, shaped by the pressures of commerce, intermarriage and survival. What this meant for the larger Viking story is difficult to overstate. The men who rode these rivers were not simply raiders who happened to turn southeast. They were participants in a continental economic system, connecting the fir forests of the far north to the silk workshops of Constantinople and the silver mines of the Arab caliphates. When Arabic coins arrived in a hoard on Gotland, they had travelled through Khazar territory and Norse hands and Baltic trade networks to get there. The river system was the mechanism that made the Viking world genuinely Eurasian, and at the end of the Dnieper, where the river finally spills into the Black Sea and the coast curves westward, the destination was always the same. Constantinople sat at the junction of Europe and Asia, at the point where the Black Sea narrowed into the Bosporus, and the Bosporus opened toward the Mediterranean. The Norse called it Miklagard, the great city, and even the name carries a weight of genuine awe. Every fur pelt, every amber bead, every slave who had survived the journey down the rapids had been moving ultimately in its direction. For a trading crew that had hauled its boat over a portage in a Russian forest and survived Pecheneg raiders on the Dnieper, the golden walls of Constantinople were not a fantasy. They were the logical conclusion of a very long, very dangerous and very deliberate journey. The river routes had made Constantinople imaginable. They had made it reachable. What happened when the Vikings finally arrived there, and what the city did to those who came in force, is where the story turned sharply more violent. They arrived, as far as the city knew, from nowhere. On the 18th of June, 860, the suburbs of Constantinople woke to fire. Norse warships had appeared in the Bosporus, shallow-drafted, low-slung vessels that had ridden rivers through the heart of a continent to reach this moment, and their crews were already ashore before any meaningful defence could be organised. The Patriarch of Constantinople, Photius, described the assault in terms that still carry the texture of genuine panic across more than 1,000 years. He called it as sudden and unexpected as a swarm of wasps. For a city that considered itself the centre of the civilized world, protected by the greatest walls ever built and defended by the most sophisticated military apparatus in Europe, that comparison was not rhetorical humility. It was honest testimony to what the city had just experienced. To understand the shock, you have to understand what Constantinople actually was. This was not simply a large and prosperous city, in the way that Paris or London might have been large and prosperous. Constantinople was, by almost every measure available in the 9th century, the most magnificent urban centre in the world west of Tang Dynasty China. Its population has been estimated at hundreds of thousands, in an era when most European cities held tens of thousands at best. Its harbour, the Golden Horn, was one of the busiest in the known world. Its markets traded in Byzantine silk woven in the imperial workshops, in gold coins of extraordinary purity, in spices, glasswork, ivory, and precious metals moving between 3 continents. The great church of Hagia Sophia, built 3 centuries before this raid and still standing today, was large enough to make every other building in the Norse world look provisional by comparison. The Theodosian walls, stretching across the peninsula on which the city stood, were not merely formidable, they were the walls that had stopped Attila the Hun, repelled the Avar siege, and survived every assault mounted against them for centuries. Constantinople was the empire's proudest fact about itself, and it had very good reasons for that pride. The Rus who came in 860 did not breach those walls. That is the first thing to say clearly, because the raid is sometimes remembered as more decisive than it was. What they did instead was something almost stranger. They occupied the space outside the walls. They burned the suburban districts. They killed residents who could not reach the city's protection in time. They crossed the short stretch of the Marmara and plundered the islands known as the Prince's Islands, carrying off whatever they could take and drowning those who resisted. For roughly 7 weeks, from mid-June to the 4th of August, they held the shores of the greatest city in the world, and the city could do almost nothing about it. The reason for that helplessness is where the timing of the raid reveals its particular genius, whether the result of deliberate intelligence gathering or extraordinary luck. Emperor Michael III was not in Constantinople when the Rus arrived. He was campaigning in Asia Minor, fighting against the Arabs on the empire's eastern frontier, which is where most of the empire's military attention and resources were focused. The imperial navy, the force that might otherwise have swept the Bosporus clear of northern longships, was occupied fighting those same Arabs in the Aegean. The city was not undefended in any absolute sense, but it was stripped of its most mobile and aggressive defensive assets at precisely the moment the Rus chose to appear. When word reached Michael that his capital was under assault, he turned back immediately, making a forced march of several hundred miles. By the time he arrived, the Rus had already withdrawn. Why they left is not entirely clear. The sources that survive, and they survive primarily on the Byzantine side, because the Rus left no written account of their own, suggest that a storm at sea, combined perhaps with the imminent return of imperial forces, convinced the raiders that staying was no longer profitable. Photius, who delivered sermons both during and after the siege that have survived as primary documents of Byzantine reaction, attributed the withdrawal to divine intervention to the Virgin Mary's protection of the city. For a patriarch whose congregation had just spent 7 weeks watching smoke rise from their suburbs, theological explanation was not merely comforting. It was the framework through which the event was processed and given meaning. What we cannot do with confidence is specify exactly how many ships came. Here the sources diverge in ways that matter. Byzantine accounts record something in the range of 200 vessels, with some contemporary accounts stretching to roughly 360. These are already large numbers. 200 shallow longships representing thousands of armed men descending on a city whose defenders were elsewhere. But the primary chronicle, compiled in Kiev centuries after the events it describes, inflates the fleet to 2,000 ships, a number that belongs less to military history than to the logic of legend, where the size of the enemy must match the scale of the threat. Medieval chroniclers on all sides had strong incentives to exaggerate the forces arrayed against their people, because larger enemies made better stories and more impressive survivals. The realistic fleet was almost certainly counted in the hundreds, not the thousands, but even hundreds of Norse warships emerging from the Bosporus was enough to send Patriarch Photius to his pulpit in a state of unconcealed terror. The men aboard those ships were Rus, the Norse-origin warrior traders whose settlements at Kiev and Novgorod and along the Dnieper river system had been building for several decades. They were, in a meaningful cultural sense, Vikings, or at least the direct inheritors of Viking methods and ambitions, even if their identity was already beginning to shift through contact with Slavic populations and Eastern trade networks. The ships themselves were the physical embodiment of that hybrid world, shallow-drafted enough to navigate rivers, seaworthy enough to cross the Black Sea, small enough to be carried overland across portages but in sufficient numbers to constitute an actual fleet. They were not the ocean-going longships that raided Lindisfarne or sailed to Normandy. They were the river longships of the eastern routes, adapted over generations for a different kind of travel, and on the 18th of June 860 they were sitting in the Bosporus while Constantinople burned. The symbolic weight of that moment is difficult to overstate, and it echoes forward through everything that follows in the Norse-Byzantine story. For the Rus, reaching Constantinople at all reaching Miklagard, the great city, was an act loaded with ambition and meaning. The city's gold, its silk, its legendary markets, and the simple fact of its existence as the grandest place in the known world had been drawing Norse attention southward through the river routes for decades. The 860 raid was not the first time the Rus had probed toward Constantinople, but it was the first time they arrived in force directly at the city's doorstep, and even though they could not break the walls, they demonstrated something that the Empire could not ignore. The river network from the Baltic to the Black Sea functioned as a highway, and the people who had mastered it could translate that mastery into naval power, capable of threatening the heart of Byzantium itself. For the Byzantines, the raid forced a recalibration. Photius's sermons describe a city that had understood itself as chosen and protected, and had just discovered that its protection was contingent. The emperor returned, the navy eventually returned, and the walls held as they had always held. But the suburban fires kept burning in Byzantine memory, and the diplomatic machinery began moving almost immediately. Within 2 years, Byzantine missionaries were travelling north toward the Rus, carrying Christianity as one instrument of the empire's response, a recognition that the people who had just terrified Constantinople could not simply be ignored or destroyed, and might be better managed as neighbours, trading partners, and eventually something more complicated still. The raid of 860 was, in the end, both less and more than it appears. Less, because the walls held, the city survived, and the Rus went home with plunder rather than conquest. More, because it established a pattern that would repeat, escalate, and eventually transform itself completely. A pattern of Norse ambition reaching toward the Golden City at the edge of two worlds, and the Golden City finding new ways to absorb, redirect, and ultimately recruit that ambition into its own service. The relationship between the Rus and Constantinople did not end with the withdrawal of 860. It deepened, complicated itself, and eventually produced one of the most dramatic stories in the entire Norse-Byzantine tradition. A story so vivid, so cinematically perfect in its details, that historians have spent generations trying to determine whether it actually happened. The year is said to be 907. The man at the centre of the story is Oleg of Novgorod, a prince of the Rus whose epithet in later tradition was the seer, a title that suggests something between prophet and cunning strategist. According to the primary chronicle, a 12th century Kievan compilation drawing on oral tradition, earlier records, and what appears to be considerable creative license, Oleg assembled a force of staggering size and directed it south along the Dnieper toward the Black Sea and ultimately toward Constantinople. The chronicle speaks of around 2,000 boats, a number that strains every available measure of logistical credibility and implies a force of tens of thousands of warriors moving as one. What happens next is where the story becomes genuinely memorable and genuinely suspicious. When Oleg's fleet reached Constantinople, the Byzantines responded with the one defensive measure they had relied on for generations. They stretched an iron chain across the entrance to the Golden Horn, the harbour inlet that protected the city's most vulnerable flank. Chain-blocked, the Rus fleet could not simply sail in and seize the waterfront. Any assault would have to come overland against walls that had never been broken. By all conventional military logic, the crisis should have stalled there, another Norse probe met by Byzantine engineering. Instead, according to the chronicle, Oleg ordered his men to haul the boats out of the water, fit them with wheels and drag them overland across the peninsula, sails filled by the wind, the fleet moving across dry land as if the sea itself had followed Oleg's command. The image is extraordinary. 2,000 ships on wheels rolling toward the greatest city in the world, while Byzantine defenders watched from the walls in horror. Oleg planted his shield on the gates of Constantinople. The empire, faced with this apparition, sued for peace. The terms were generous. A Byzantine tribute counted in silver grivnas per Rus boat, favourable trading rights for Rus merchants visiting the city, and a formal treaty that acknowledged the Rus as a power worth negotiating with rather than simply repelling. It is a tremendous story. The problem is that it may be almost entirely invented. No Byzantine source from the period, not a chronicle, not an administrative record, not a sermon or a letter, mentions any such raid in 907. This is not simply an absence of confirmation, it is a pointed silence, because Byzantine chroniclers were meticulous about recording threats to Constantinople. The city's near misses and survivals were woven into its identity. The 860 raid left documentary traces precisely because it happened and terrified people who then wrote about it. The 907 episode left nothing on the Greek side. Nothing from the imperial court, nothing from the church, nothing from the network of literate observers who constituted Byzantine record-keeping. For an event that allegedly involved thousands of ships appearing at the city's harbour and a fleet being dragged overland within sight of the city walls, that silence is very difficult to explain as oversight. What has survived from 907 and from 911 is the treaty itself, or at least versions of it embedded in the chronicle, and the treaty is real. Scholars working on Rus-Byzantine relations broadly accept that some form of diplomatic agreement governing trade access and mutual obligations was negotiated in this period. The terms are specific enough, and their echoes in later Byzantine commercial arrangements concrete enough to carry the weight of authenticity. Something happened between Oleg's Rus and the Byzantine Empire in the years around 907 to 911. A relationship was formalized, rights were granted, tribute or payments of some kind changed hands. The question historians ask is whether the dramatic military episode was the cause of that treaty, or whether the treaty came first, or emerged from a different kind of pressure, and the dramatic episode was constructed afterward to explain it. Scholars including H. Gregoire and Opritsak have argued that the Oleg Constantinople narrative is essentially a literary fabrication built by later Rus chroniclers working backward from the existence of a favourable treaty. If the Rus of Kiev had secured extraordinary commercial access to Constantinople, the right to trade without paying duties, the right to bathe in the imperial baths, the right to be provisioned at Byzantine expense, then surely some great feat of arms must have won it. The treaty demanded a story. The story was supplied. There is also the question of the date itself. Some historians have suggested that if any military confrontation occurred, it might belong to 904, a year when Byzantium was already under pressure from Arab naval activity in the Aegean under Leo of Tripoli, a moment of imperial distraction not unlike the circumstances of 860. The chronicle's date of 907 may represent a conflation, a rounding, or an outright reassignment, attaching dramatic events to the most diplomatically significant moment, rather than to the moment they might actually have occurred. And the ships on wheels, 2,000 of them dragged by manpower across a Byzantine peninsula. The mechanical logic here collapses under scrutiny. The claim is not quite impossible in isolation. The Rus were known to portage their boats overland at river junctions, hauling relatively small craft across distances of a few kilometres. But those portages involved individual vessels carried by their crews across terrain that had been used for exactly that purpose for generations. The image in the chronicle scales that practical technique to an apocalyptic fantasy, an entire fleet, wheeled like chariots, moving through a landscape that would have required clearing, levelling, and defending against Byzantine sorties simultaneously. The drama of the image is precisely what gives it away as legend. This is a storyteller's touch, not a logistician's report. What the story does reflect, even in its embellishments, is something genuine about the values and anxieties of Viking Age storytelling. The wheeled ships are not just dramatic detail. They are a statement about the kind of leader Oleg was understood to be. A man who found unexpected solutions, who turned the enemy's defences against them, who made the impossible happen through will and ingenuity. That is a consistent motif in Norse tradition, where the cleverest warrior is as admired as the strongest. The poisoned cups that appear elsewhere in Oleg's legend, a Byzantine attempt supposedly to test whether Oleg could be killed by treachery, carry the same logic. The great leader sees through the trap and refuses the drink. He cannot be surprised, cannot be outmaneuvered, cannot be stopped. These stories tell us less about what Oleg did than about what the Rus wanted to believe about themselves and their relationship with the overwhelming power of Byzantium. To have extracted a favourable treaty from the most sophisticated empire in the world required in retrospect a legendary justification. The city that had humiliated every enemy who came against its walls had somehow been made to yield. Only a hero of the calibre that stories could contain, a seer, a man who moved his fleet across land and planted his shield on the gates of heaven, could have done it. The treaty of 907 and 911 was real. The commercial relationship it formalised was real. The ambition of the Rus to reach Constantinople, to trade there, to eventually serve there and fight there, was absolutely real. but the raid that supposedly won those concessions exists in a space between history and invention that no amount of scholarship has fully resolved. It may have happened in some form. It may have been a later elaboration on a smaller, undocumented confrontation. It may have been assembled whole from the raw material of the 860 attack, and the wishful thinking of 12th century chroniclers who wanted their ancestors to have been worthy of the advantages they received. What makes the uncertainty itself valuable is this. The story survived because it captured something true about the relationship between the Rus and Constantinople. Not a true event, perhaps, but a true ambition, a true dynamic, a true recognition on both sides that these two powers had to reckon with each other, and that reckoning was about to take a far less ambiguous form. The reckoning came in 941, and it was catastrophic. Whatever the truth of Oleg's legendary campaign, the wheeled ships, the planted shield, the treaty won by audacity or clever diplomacy or some combination of both, the Rus of Kiev had maintained their access to Constantinople for a generation by the time Igor I assembled his fleet and moved south. Igor was Oleg's successor, a ruler who had spent years managing the fractious relationships of Kievan politics while watching the commercial privileges his predecessor had secured slowly erode. The Byzantines, facing their own pressures from Arab power in the east and south, had less patience for generous tribute arrangements. Igor wanted what the Rus believed was owed them. He would take it by force if necessary. The scale of what he launched is one of those numbers that medieval chroniclers rendered in the language of awe rather than accountancy. The primary chronicle speaks of fleets so large they darken the water. 10,000 ships, 15,000, figures that belong to epic rather than logistics. Modern historians, working from the available evidence of what the Rus could credibly mobilize and supply along the Dnieper route to the Black Sea, settle on something far smaller but still formidable. Around 1,000 ships, carrying an army capable of real devastation. That is still an extraordinary concentration of seaborne power for the 10th century, and when Igor's fleet arrived on the Asian side of the Bosporus in May of 941, it hit the surrounding coastline with genuine ferocity. Byzantine sources record the burning of villages, the killing and capture of civilians, churches pillaged and put to the torch. The Rus were not exploring. They were punishing. What Igor did not know, what no one in the Rus fleet apparently had reliable intelligence about, was what waited in the harbour of Constantinople. The Byzantine navy had been quietly reorganizing. Most of its active fighting fleet was committed to campaigns in the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean, dealing with the perennial problem of Arab naval power under commanders like Leo of Tripoli, who had devastated Byzantine coastal cities within living memory. What remained in the capital's harbour when Igor arrived were 15 war galleys, 15 dromons, which Byzantine sources describe as old, retired from frontline service, ships that might have seemed, to an observer watching from shore, like the skeleton of a navy rather than its cutting edge. The Rus saw those ships. They surrounded them. In the strategic logic that had governed every seaborne assault the Rus had ever conducted, that kind of numerical encirclement was the last act of a battle. What happened next reordered the entire framework. The Byzantine crews opened their bronze siphons. Greek fire is one of those weapons that survived the fall of the empire that created it primarily as a rumour, a whispered inheritance of terror. The formula was a state secret so closely guarded that its exact composition disappeared with Byzantium itself, and historians and chemists have spent centuries arguing about what it actually contained. The broad outlines are established. A petroleum-based mixture, almost certainly incorporating quicklime, sulphur and various resins, possibly including saltpeter in later formulations. What mattered in practice was what it did. The mixture was heated under pressure and projected through bronze tubes, the siphons, mounted on the bows and flanks of the dromons, turning the ship itself into a directed weapon rather than merely a platform for soldiers. The flame it produced was not ordinary fire, it clung. It spread across water rather than being extinguished by it. It adhered to wood, to rope, to the tar that waterproofed every hull in Igor's fleet. Once it touched a ship, the ship was already lost. The only question was how quickly. Byzantine chroniclers recorded what came next with a precision that suggests they understood they were witnessing something that would need to be remembered. The Rus fleet had surrounded the 15 dromons, pressing close, ready to board. The siphons opened. Streams of liquid fire arced across the water and found the encircling ships. The accounts say that warriors who had crossed the Baltic in open boats, who had run the falls of the Dnieper and crossed the Black Sea in autumn storms, jumped from their burning vessels into the water and drowned. They preferred it. The weight of their armour pulled them down, and they let it, because drowning was faster and less terrible than what the fire would do. The water itself appeared to burn. Men tried to swim through flame and found no passage. Those who made it to shore were captured or killed by Byzantine forces waiting on the coastline. The 15 ships were enough. What the Rus had encountered was not a larger fleet or a stronger army, but a different order of military science entirely. The application of chemistry and engineering to warfare in a way that reduced the traditional Viking calculus of courage versus courage to something irrelevant. A longship crew could outfight almost anything that came at them man for man. They had no answer for fire projected from a distance that clung to everything it touched and could not be beaten out or submerged. The surviving ships, sources suggest only a fraction of what Igor had brought south, managed to withdraw. Scattered back toward the Crimea, Byzantine forces pursued and destroyed more of them in a second engagement, a hammer blow after the ambush. By the time the remnants reached friendly shores, the catastrophe was complete. The campaign that was supposed to restore Rus commercial privilege and demonstrate the price of Byzantine ingratitude had become instead a demonstration of Byzantine capability, a public lesson in the distance between northern raiding tradition and imperial military technology. There is something in the contrast worth holding for a moment. The Vikings who built and crewed those ships were genuinely remarkable. People who had navigated thousands of miles of open water, who had learned the moods of the Black Sea and the Dnieper's currents, who had survived everything the Norse world produced in terms of cold and violence and distance. That competence was real, and it was extraordinary. But competence against a weapon you have never encountered and cannot conceptually prepare for is worth almost nothing in the moment of contact. The Greek fire did not defeat a weak enemy. It defeated one of the most effective seaborne military forces on Earth by operating entirely outside the parameters that made that force effective. Igor survived. He returned to Kiev, reorganized, and by 944 had assembled another fleet, this time moving with enough menace that the Byzantines sent envoys to meet him before he reached the Bosporus. A new treaty was negotiated. The terms were less favourable to the Rus than the agreements of 907 and 911, a reflection of the fact that the empire had just demonstrated it could defend itself. But the treaty was real, and it held, and it reopened the trade routes and commercial access that made the Constantinople connection valuable in the first place. That is the shape of what 941 actually accomplished, beneath the fire and the drowning and the scattered remnants of a shattered fleet. It established the terms on which the Rus and Byzantium would have to coexist. Outright conquest was not possible. The city's walls had never fallen, and its navy, even depleted to 15 retired dromons, could destroy 1,000 ships when it had the right weapon and the right moment. The Rus understood this now in their bones, not as an abstract proposition but as the memory of men choosing to sink rather than burn. From that understanding almost inevitably came a different kind of relationship. If you could not take Constantinople, you could serve it. If you could not break its gates, you could guard them. The warriors who had survived 941 and the generations that came after them looked at the Golden City not as a prize to be seized, but as something rarer and stranger, an employer, a patron, a place where a man from the north could make his fortune fighting under the double eagle rather than against it. The road from the burning ships of 941 to the imperial palace, where Norsemen stood guard in gilded armour, is not a long one. It runs directly through the moment when Greek fire hit the water and changed everything. While the Rus were learning the hard lessons of Byzantine firepower in the eastern Mediterranean, another branch of the Norse world was pushing in an entirely different direction, west and then south, threading through the Atlantic's edge and into waters that no Scandinavian fleet had any business navigating. The man credited with leading that expedition is one of the most legendary figures in the entire Viking saga tradition, which is both the most compelling thing about him and the most important reason to treat his story carefully. Björn Ironside occupies a peculiar position in Norse history, vivid enough to feel real, yet filtered through layers of later saga writing that make the precise historical man difficult to separate from the myth that accumulated around him. The contemporary Frankish annals and Italian chronicles do record a large Viking fleet operating in the western Mediterranean, in the years 859 to 861, and most accounts associate that fleet with two commanders, one of them Björn and the other a figure named Hastein, a Dane who appears across multiple sources as a raider of considerable ambition and tactical intelligence. What exactly these men looked like, what they planned, and how much of what is attributed to them they actually did, these questions carry genuine uncertainty. What is less uncertain is that the raid happened, that it was substantial, and that it reached Sicily. To understand why Sicily mattered, you need to picture what the island had become by the mid-9th century. The Arabs had begun their conquest of Sicily in 827, and by the time Björn's fleet was assembling somewhere in the Frankish Atlantic coast, they controlled the majority of the island, with their administrative and cultural capital at Palermo. The city they had built there was not a frontier garrison town. It was a genuine metropolitan centre, one of the largest cities in the entire Mediterranean world at that moment, larger than Rome, arguably rivaling Constantinople in certain measures of commercial activity. Arab geographers wrote about Palermo with the kind of superlatives usually reserved for the greatest cities of the Islamic world. Mosques, markets, irrigated orchards, producing crops that had never grown in Sicily before the Arab introduction of new agricultural techniques, workshops producing silk and luxury goods, and port facilities channeling the trade of the central Mediterranean through Sicilian harbours. The island sat at the crossroads of everything, the sea routes between North Africa and southern Europe, between the western and eastern Mediterranean, between the commerce of the Arab world and the fragmented, often desperate economies of the Christian kingdoms to the north. For a Viking commander looking at a map, or more precisely at the accumulated intelligence that came from sailors and merchants and captives who had been through those waters, Sicily read as a concentration of wealth at a location that no one would expect a northern fleet to reach. That combination, rich target, minimal expectation of attack, was exactly the logic that had driven Viking raiding across 2 centuries of expanding ambition. The fleet that made the attempt was, by any measure, remarkable. Medieval sources give numbers that scholars approach with practiced skepticism. Figures like 200 longships appear in the accounts, and if each ship carried somewhere between 70 and 100 warriors, that translates to somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 men. Modern historians treat those numbers as an upper bound rather than a reliable census, because medieval chroniclers across every tradition systematically inflated the scale of dramatic events, and because assembling and supplying a force of 20,000 men on an extended Mediterranean raid presents logistical challenges that the sources never adequately explain. The honest answer is that the fleet was large enough to constitute a genuine military force rather than a raiding party, and that the precise numbers are simply not recoverable from what has survived. What matters more than counting ships is understanding what those ships represented: the deliberate extension of Norse maritime power into waters that demanded entirely new navigational knowledge. Getting to Sicily required threading the Strait of Gibraltar, which the Norse called the Norvasund, and then navigating a sea whose currents, winds, shoals, and political geography were utterly unlike anything in the Norse experience. The Atlantic approaches were familiar. The Bay of Biscay was not friendly water, but it was known water. Once through the strait, everything changed. Mediterranean weather patterns behave differently from Atlantic ones. The sea itself has different tidal rhythms. The coastlines that mattered, Iberia's Mediterranean shore, the Balearic Islands, the Italian peninsula, the North African coast visible on clear days from a ship's deck, were places where the existing intelligence networks of the Norse world thinned to almost nothing. And yet the fleet navigated it. They raided along the Spanish coast, struck the Balearics, pushed down toward North Africa, and then turned northeast towards Sicily. The raid on Sicily itself was not, by the standards of what the fleet had accomplished just by arriving there, a spectacular military success. The sources record fighting and looting, but not the kind of overwhelming conquest that would have produced a sustained occupation. The Muslim defenders of Sicily were experienced and organised. They had been fighting a grinding territorial war across the island for 3 decades by that point, and a Norse fleet arriving on the coast was a new kind of problem, but not an insurmountable one. What Björn and Hastein appear to have achieved was what Viking commanders had always been most effective at: rapid descent, extraction of portable wealth, and withdrawal before a coordinated defence could be mounted. They demonstrated that the island could be reached and struck. not that it could be taken. That demonstration matters in ways that go beyond the counting of silver and captives taken from Sicilian shores. The 860 expedition, and here it is worth acknowledging that the dating itself carries some uncertainty, with different sources anchoring events to slightly different years within the broader 859 to 861 window, represents something significant in the larger pattern of how the Norse world expanded its understanding of what was possible. Every generation of Viking raiders had pushed slightly further than the last, and each extension required absorbing new information, developing new competencies, and accepting new risks. The men who first crossed the North Sea thought they were at the edge of the navigable world. Their successors crossed the North Atlantic and reached Iceland and eventually Greenland and the American coast. Others had taken the Dnieper route to the Black Sea and found Constantinople. Now a fleet had gone the other direction entirely, south and east, through waters that connected the world of the Norse to the world of the Caliphate and the ruins of Roman civilization in ways that no longship crew had ever experienced directly. There is something almost experimental about it. The systematic testing of limits that the Norse conducted across the 9th century, each expedition carrying back not just loot but information. Where can a ship go? What will you find there? Who can you fight, and what can you take, and what will kill you? The answers accumulated across generations and produced the extraordinary geographical reach of the Norse world at its height. Sicily was one data point in that larger experiment. The fleet came back, or most of it did, the sources are vague about losses, and the knowledge came back with it. The island was real, it was reachable, it was guarded but not invulnerable, and it sat in the middle of a sea that had been, for the first time, demonstrated to be within the operational range of a Norse fleet willing to make the passage. That knowledge would resurface, not in the way that Björn or Hastein, if they truly commanded that expedition, might have imagined, not through another Norse fleet arriving from the Atlantic with longships full of raiders. The next Norseman to fight in Sicily would come from an entirely different direction, carrying imperial standards and fighting under Byzantine command. But the thread runs continuous. The Norse reached Sicily, found it interesting, and left traces, in chronicles and annals and the long memory of what that sea could hold, that belong to a story still very much in motion. Sicily did not become a fixed point in the Norse mental map simply because a fleet reached it and came home with plunder. The island earned its place in the Viking imagination through something more durable than a single raid, through what it represented as a concept, as a location, and as a recurring stage on which Scandinavian ambition kept returning to perform. Think about what the men who sailed on that expedition actually experienced when they looked at Sicily. They had come through the Atlantic, through the Norvesund, across a sea none of them had ever sailed before, and they had arrived at an island that was simultaneously three things at once. It was Islamic, governed by the Aghlabid dynasty, and anchored by a city, Palermo, that rivaled anything in the Christian world for sophistication and population. It was Byzantine in living memory, and still contested in administrative terms, with the Eastern Empire's cultural fingerprints pressed into the architecture and ecclesiastical landscape of towns that had changed hands within living memory. And it was Latin in its oldest sediment, threaded through with the remnants of Roman roads and Lombard-influenced settlements in the interior and along the coasts that the Arab advance had not fully absorbed. Sicily in the 9th century was not one world. It was three worlds compacted into an island smaller than most European kingdoms, each world defending its claim against the others, with the sustained violence of people who understood exactly what was at stake. For Norse warriors arriving from outside all three of those traditions, the island would have presented something vertiginous, a place where the lines dividing civilization from civilization were drawn in blood and architecture simultaneously, where mosques stood within sight of Byzantine churches, and where the port of Palermo channeled the commercial energy of a trade network that stretched from the Sahara to the Levant. The sheer density of contested wealth concentrated in that small space made Sicily legible to the Norse in a very particular way. They understood contested frontiers. They understood the logic of places where power was distributed unevenly, and where the gaps between competing authorities created opportunity. What they found in Sicily was that logic operating at Mediterranean scale, with higher stakes than anything in the Frankish world or the British Isles. The raid itself, as established, was not a conquest, but raids in the Norse tradition were rarely just raids. The practical extraction of movable wealth was always layered over with something else, with the accumulation of reputation, with the proof of reach, with the demonstration that a commander and his warriors could go where others could not and return intact. When Björn and Hastein brought their fleet home, they brought more than whatever silver and captives the ships could carry. They brought a story about the edge of the world that could be reached, and stories of that kind had their own currency in a culture that measured a man's worth partly by the geography his ambitions had forced him to master. The expedition was reconnaissance as much as it was raiding, and prestige-seeking as much as it was reconnaissance. The myth-making that followed was perhaps inevitable. In a tradition that transformed every significant voyage into saga material, Sicily, exotic, distant, fractured between three civilizations, was exactly the kind of destination that grew in the telling. The precise details of what happened there became less important over time than the fact that it had happened at all, that Norse ships had reached the centre of the Mediterranean and struck at one of its most contested prizes. The island entered Scandinavian awareness as a byword for the far south, for the deep Mediterranean, for the place where the known world became something stranger and more dangerous and more rewarding than the familiar violence of the northern seas. And then, a century and a half later, Scandinavian warriors appeared in that same region again, not as raiders arriving from the Atlantic, but as soldiers operating inside the Byzantine military system. The first recorded varangian mercenaries in Italy appear in sources from the 930s, a generation before the formal establishment of the Varangian Guard. By 1038, when the general George Maniacs launched a Byzantine campaign to reconquer Sicily from the Arabs, who had by then completed their domination of the island, there were Norse warriors in his army. One of them was a young Norwegian nobleman named Harald, who would eventually become King of Norway under the epithet Hardråde, the hard ruler, and whose Mediterranean campaigns would make him one of the most travelled men of the 11th century world. The wheel had turned. The same island that an earlier generation of Norse warriors had struck from outside the imperial system was now being fought over by Norse warriors operating inside it. That continuity is not coincidental. The knowledge that Sicily was reachable, and that the Mediterranean south of the Italian peninsula was legitimate terrain for Scandinavian ambition, had been embedded in the culture by the earlier expedition and kept alive through the developing channels of Varangian service. Each generation of Norse warriors who entered Byzantine employment heard about the campaigns of earlier Varangians, and those earlier campaigns reached back, through the accumulating layers of Norse memory, toward that first fleet from the 860s. The chain of transmission was not formal. There were no written records in Scandinavia itself to consult, but the chain existed through the rune stones raised in Sweden for men who died in Langbadeiland. The Old Norse term that translated roughly as the land of the Lombards, used to describe southern Italy and, by extension, the whole contested zone that included Sicily. Those stones are not military histories. They are grief markers, raised by families for men who did not come home. But they encode geographical knowledge in the act of naming. They tell us that the community understood where Langbardeland was, that it was a real destination rather than a mythic one, and that going there was something Norse warriors did with enough regularity to make runestones commemorating the journey a recognised cultural form. The scholarly debate about whether Langbardeland referred specifically to Sicily or more broadly to southern Italy is genuine, and it is worth acknowledging. But the uncertainty at the edges of that definition does not diminish its significance. What the runestones demonstrate is that Sicily and the surrounding region had crossed the threshold from exotic rumour into recognised landmark in the Norse spatial imagination, a place with a name, a place where real people went and sometimes died, a place woven into the emotional and memorial fabric of Scandinavian life. Sicily also became a waypoint rather than just a destination. When King Sigurd of Norway set out on his crusading voyage in 1107, he stopped at Sicily on the way south, following a route that had by then accumulated multiple layers of Norse association. The island was no longer just the distant prize that Björn's fleet had struck from the open sea. It was a known port of call, a place where a Scandinavian fleet could anchor with some confidence that the waters and the political landscape were navigable. The Mediterranean had been mapped, imperfectly but functionally, onto the Norse understanding of where the world extended. That is what Sicily came to mean in the Viking imagination. Not the memory of a single raid, which was always uncertain in its details and limited in its immediate consequences, but the proof of concept that had lodged itself in Norse culture and refused to leave, the demonstration that the central Mediterranean was reachable, that its contested edges were legible to northern warriors who understood contested edges intimately, and that the rewards waiting there were worth the risk of the passage. Every Norseman who subsequently fought under Byzantine banners in the south, every warrior commemorated on a runestone for dying in Langbordalen, every king who paused his crusading fleet in Sicilian harbours was in some sense acting on knowledge that had first been brought back by ships returning from that extraordinary southern voyage. The island was a beginning disguised as a destination, and the story it started was far from finished. The transition from raiding outsider to salaried soldier did not happen overnight, and it did not happen through a single dramatic negotiation. It happened because two very different kinds of ambition found each other at the right historical moment, and because the Byzantine Empire, for all its sophistication and centuries of accumulated political wisdom, had developed a persistent problem that Norse warriors happened to be uniquely positioned to solve. By the late 10th century, Constantinople had survived long enough to accumulate enemies in layers. Arab fleets pressed from the south and east. Bulgarian armies probed the northern frontier. Rus raiders had struck from the Black Sea with terrifying speed, twice in living memory, and inside the palace itself a different kind of threat moved more quietly. The palace coup, the ambitious general with loyal domestic troops, the conspiracy that could unseat an emperor before dawn and have a new one crowned by mid-morning. The Byzantines had made an art form of political survival, and they understood something that less self-aware empires sometimes missed. The men most likely to kill an emperor were the men closest to him, and the men closest to him were usually men with Roman names, Roman family connections, and Roman political ambitions of their own. Loyalty in Constantinople was always, in some sense, a wager. The solution that emerged from this long institutional anxiety was elegant in its perversity. You protected the emperor not with men who loved the empire, but with men who had no stake in it, men whose loyalty was personal, transactional, and architecturally severed from local political networks by the simple fact of their foreignness. A Norse warrior had no cousins in the Senate, no ancestral estates in Anatolia, no dynastic ambitions threading through the city's ecclesiastical hierarchies. He could be paid, provisioned, housed, and armed, and the single thread connecting him to his employer was the employer himself. Cut that thread, and the Norse warrior had nothing, which meant there was every practical reason to keep it intact. Byzantine chroniclers articulated this logic with a clarity that suggests it was not an improvised rationale but a considered doctrine. Foreign troops, they noted, lacked local political loyalties, and that absence, that structural disconnection from the webs of Roman factional life, was precisely their value. The emperor who surrounded himself with northern swords was not weakening himself by relying on barbarians. He was insulating himself from the particular vulnerability that came with power in a city where everyone else was always calculating. The formal culmination of this logic arrived in 988, when Emperor Basil II found himself in a desperate position. His general Bardas Phocas had revolted, and Basil needed troops he could trust absolutely. Troops who had no reason to defect to a rival claimant because they had no local ties to make defection profitable. He turned to Vladimir I of Kiev, the Rus ruler who had been converting his people to Orthodox Christianity, and who had his own reasons for cultivating Byzantine goodwill. The agreement they reached was dense with mutual benefit. Vladimir would receive Anna, the emperor's own sister, in marriage, an extraordinary concession, since Byzantine princesses were almost never given to foreign rulers, and in exchange Vladimir would send Basil a force of approximately 6,000 Scandinavian warriors. The number, drawn from Byzantine and Rus chronicles, may be rounded or somewhat symbolic rather than a precise head count. Scholars have noted that medieval sources often preferred numerically satisfying figures over exact census data. But whatever the precise count, the strategic impact was concrete. These were not irregulars scraped together for a single campaign. They were hardened fighters, predominantly Norse in origin, many of them veterans of the Rus river routes who had spent years navigating the violence of the Dnieper corridor and the politics of Rus principalities. They arrived in Constantinople as a coherent military unit, and Basil incorporated them into something that had been developing in informal versions for at least a generation, a permanent corps of imperial bodyguards that would come to be known as the Varangian Guard. The word Varangian derived from the Old Norse term for men bound together by oath, varingar, and it carried with it the implication of a sworn compact, a mutual obligation, something more durable than a simple employment contract. The naming mattered. These were not hired swords in the contemptuous sense that phrase sometimes implies. They were oath-bound soldiers whose commitment was framed in terms that would have been familiar to any Norse warrior who had pledged loyalty to a jarl in the hall. The cultural mechanism was Scandinavian even if the employer was Byzantine, and that made the arrangement psychologically coherent in a way that pure mercenary service sometimes failed to be. What had changed on the Norse side was the calculus of ambition. The warriors who had sailed with Björn Ironside towards Sicily a century earlier were pursuing wealth through extraction, arriving fast, taking what could be moved, and leaving before organised resistance could gather. That model had always had a ceiling. The plunder was real but finite, the reputation earned but impermanent once the ships turned north, the enterprise repeatable only if you could keep assembling fleets and finding new targets. The world of the late 10th century was contracting around that model. The Frankish coastlines had hardened their defences. The English kingdoms were finding better ways to resist, or to buy time, or to turn Norse settlers into taxpayers rather than raiders. The pure raiding economy was still operating, but its margins were thinning. Elite military service offered something different. Reliable pay and some of the best coin in the medieval world, the prestige of operating inside the most sophisticated state apparatus in Christendom, and access to a career structure that rewarded performance with advancement rather than just survival. A Norse warrior who joined the Varangian Guard was not surrendering his ambitions. He was redirecting them through a more durable channel. The Guard offered wealth, honour, and the particular kind of recognition that came from being trusted, genuinely, structurally trusted, with the life of an emperor. For men from a culture that measured worth partly through the quality of the lord one served, serving the Lord of Constantinople was a claim of the highest order. There was something else, too, that the Guard provided, and it would prove to be its most consequential feature for the story that was still unfolding. Once inside the Byzantine military system, Norse warriors did not stay in Constantinople. They went where the empire needed soldiers, and the empire's needs stretched across the entire Mediterranean basin. Varangians found themselves campaigning in Bulgaria, in Anatolia, in the Aegean, and increasingly, as the 11th century progressed, in the same southern waters that had drawn Norse ships 150 years earlier. The Guard was not just a destination. It was a mechanism, a formal institutional channel through which Scandinavian warriors were fed continuously into the deep Mediterranean, far beyond the city where they were sworn and billeted. The irony was not lost on anyone paying attention to the longer arc. Men whose ancestors had twice attempted to storm Constantinople from outside, who had been hurled back by Greek fire and chain boom and the terrible mathematics of Byzantine naval defence, now slept inside its walls as the personal guardians of the emperor. The hostility had been alchemized, through a combination of Rus politics, orthodox conversion, and imperial pragmatism, into something that served both parties better than the hostility ever had. The empire got its loyal northern swords, the Norse got their career path into the wealthiest city in the Western world, and everyone who came after, every Varangian who would be dispatched on campaign, every runestone that would be raised in Sweden for a man who died in service far to the south, was the product of that 988 agreement and the institutional machinery it set in motion. The gate of Constantinople had been shut to Norse fleets more than once. Now it opened from the inside by imperial invitation, and the men who walked through it carried their axes into places the earlier raiders could never have reached. Walk through that gate, and the world that met a Norse warrior was unlike anything the North could prepare him for. Constantinople in the late 10th and 11th centuries held perhaps 400,000 people, a number that dwarfs every Scandinavian town of the era so completely that the comparison barely registers. A man who had grown up in a longhouse settlement where the population of the nearest market might number in the hundreds was now stationed in a city where the morning crowd at a single harbour quay outnumbered entire Norwegian valleys. The Golden Horn alone, the curving inlet of water that formed the city's northern harbour, was perpetually choked with merchant vessels from Egypt, Georgia, Italy, and the Rus steppe. The smell hit first: salt water, rotting fish, wood smoke from the chandlers' workshops, and beneath it all the particular sweetness of Byzantine silk dye, a chemical perfume that clung to the harbour district's air like incense. The Guard's primary billet was the Boucaleon Palace complex, a sprawling compound of marble courts and gilded reception halls built directly against the seawall overlooking the Marmara. Guardsmen who walked its corridors moved through rooms that had accumulated imperial decoration for centuries, mosaic floors depicting emperors long dead, ivory panels, curtains of embroidered silk, oil lamps whose light caught gold leaf on every available surface. The aesthetic shock for a warrior from Scandinavia would have been total. Nothing in the Norse world, not the carved halls of the greatest jarls, not the silver-hung interiors of the richest longhouses, remotely approached the sheer density of accumulated wealth that the Byzantines had built into their daily architectural environment. The palace was not just luxurious. It was a statement of power so sustained and so deliberate that simply inhabiting it reshaped how a man understood the relationship between authority and material culture. Hagia Sophia was a short walk away, and the guard attended the emperor there on ceremonial occasions. The building's interior was almost physically disorienting in its scale, the dome appearing to float on a ring of light, the walls surfaced in panels of coloured marble, the upper galleries gleaming with gold mosaic that caught and multiplied the candles below. A varangian standing in that nave was not simply a soldier performing a ceremonial duty. He was a witness to something that the Byzantine state had engineered specifically to overwhelm the senses and communicate without words the theological and political claims of the empire. It worked. Saga accounts and later Norse references to Constantinople, they called it Miklagard, the great city, carry a note of genuine awe that no amount of cultural distance entirely explains away. They had simply seen something they could not have imagined before they saw it. But the guards' relationship to Constantinople was not purely ceremonial. Their battlefield role was specific and severe. They were held in reserve during engagements, not deployed as ordinary infantry. The Byzantines used them the way a commander uses his best remaining card, committing them only when the critical moment had arrived and subtlety had been exhausted. When they did fight, their weapon of choice was the broad-bladed Dane axe, a long-hafted instrument capable of shearing through armour in ways that the shorter swords of Byzantine regulars could not match. Byzantine chroniclers, working from a Greek military vocabulary that had no precise term for this weapon, sometimes called it a rhomphaea, a slightly bewildered transliteration that modern scholars have largely unravelled as a miscategorization. The axe, wielded in great two-handed sweeps, gave the guard a ferocious close-quarters capability. Combined with their sturdy shields and a battlefield reputation that preceded them into engagements, they were an intimidating force to face, and a reassuring one to have alongside. Their oath was sworn to the throne itself, not to any individual emperor, which meant their loyalty survived transitions of power that would have destabilized a more politically entangled unit. Byzantine chroniclers marvelled at what they described as an almost familial devotion. The guard would kneel before a new emperor without hesitation, the oath simply transferring by the mechanics of the institution. This structural loyalty was, of course, exactly what the empire had designed them to provide. But it was also congruent with Norse warrior culture, in which the oath sworn in a lord's hall was a binding commitment that carried real social weight. The Guard had found an institutional framework that translated their own cultural values into Byzantine political utility. Both sides were satisfied by the same mechanism, and when an emperor died, the Guard exercised a privilege that made them wealthy men by any standard, the right of palace pillaging, known in their own language as pollutersvarf. At the moment of imperial death, varangians were permitted, formally, by custom, to rush the imperial treasury and carry away as much gold, gems and valuables as they could physically bear. This was not looting in the chaotic sense. It was a structured, recognized entitlement, a kind of death benefit that the empire had institutionalized to supplement regular pay and maintain the Guard's enthusiasm for service across what could be long and difficult campaigns. A single pollutersvarf event could transform a Norse warrior into a man of considerable fortune. Several such events over a career of service, combined with regular salary paid in Byzantine gold, could make a returning varangian the wealthiest man in his home district by an order of magnitude. That wealth was visible. Saga accounts describe varangians coming home in scarlet cloaks dyed with Byzantine pigments, unavailable in the north, wearing gilt saddles, carrying gold-inlaid daggers and helmets worked by Byzantine craftsmen. These were not subtle displays. They were deliberate broadcasts of experience and status, meant to communicate immediately to anyone watching that this man had been somewhere extraordinary and had been trusted, by the most powerful court in Christendom, to carry weapons in the emperor's presence. In a culture where reputation was a durable social currency, this was a remarkable return on investment. The young man who left for Constantinople to seek his fortune was not just coming back rich. He was coming back transformed, carrying in his material possessions a visible record of his time inside the greatest city in the world. The physical evidence of their presence in that city survives in unexpected places. Inside Hagia Sophia, on the marble balustrades of the upper gallery, runic inscriptions were scratched by hands that had apparently found the solemn interior no deterrent to the universal impulse to leave a mark. Most are fragmentary, a name, a partial phrase, the Norse equivalent of "I was here," but they are genuine, and they anchor the Varangians in that building with a specificity that saga accounts alone cannot provide. A Dane or Norwegian or Swede stood at that railing, looked down at the candlelit floor below, and cut his name into marble that is still there. The Piraeus lion, a massive Greek marble statue that stood at the harbour of Athens, was covered in runic inscriptions by Varangians passing through, so thoroughly that the lion was eventually carried off to Venice, where it still stands outside the arsenal, its Norse graffiti still legible to those who know how to read it. Back in Scandinavia, families who sent men to the guard and did not see them return had rune stones raised in their memory. Dozens of these stones from Sweden and Norway commemorate men who died in Greece or the Greek lands, a geographical designation that stretched in Norse usage to cover the entire Byzantine world. They are not elaborate. They do not record campaigns or victories. They record names and loss and the quiet fact of distance. A son or a husband went south and did not come back, and someone in a Swedish field commissioned a carving that would outlast every living memory of the man himself. Those stones are still standing in the Swedish countryside today, moss-covered and weathered, and they connect a specific dead man to the marble balustrades of Hagia Sophia and the harbour smells of the Golden Horn with a directness that crosses 1,000 years without losing its weight. Service in the Guard did not simply enrich the men who performed it. It rewired them. They returned knowing what the most sophisticated civilization in the medieval West looked like from the inside, carrying aesthetic and cultural impressions that fed back into Scandinavian art, architecture, and ambition in ways that are difficult to trace precisely, but impossible to dismiss entirely. Constantinople had taken Norse swords and given back Norse men who were, in some irreversible sense, larger than the world that had produced them, and the Guard itself went on, dispatching warriors south and east into campaigns that still lay ahead, following the ambitions of an empire whose reach extended far beyond any city's walls. Among all the men who passed through the Varangian Guard, one left a shadow long enough to fall across 2 continents and 3 decades of medieval history. His name before history claimed him was simply Harald Sigurdsson, a Norwegian prince in his mid-teens who fought on the losing side at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, where his half-brother King Olaf was killed and Harald himself took wounds serious enough that he had to be carried from the field by men who were almost certainly risking their own lives to do it. He was 15 years old, exiled, and dependent on the charity of foreign courts. He would not see Norway again for over a decade. The path from Stiklestad to Constantinople was not direct, but it was purposeful. Harald spent several years in the service of Yaroslav the Wise, the Grand Prince of Kiev and Rus, commanding a force of several hundred men and learning the kind of institutional warfare that a battlefield upbringing in Norway could not have taught him. Yaroslav's court was a sophisticated place, literate, politically networked across Europe, and deeply familiar with Byzantine culture through decades of trade and religious connection. It was the right preparation for what came next. Around 1033 or 1034, Harald arrived in Constantinople and entered the Varangian Guard. He was perhaps 18 or 19. He had already been a soldier for half his remembered life. He rose quickly. The Guard was not an organisation that promoted sentiment over capability, and whatever Harald's personal qualities, the sagas describe him as physically enormous and strategically cold-blooded. They translated well into Byzantine military service. Within a few years he held a leadership position, commanding a significant contingent of Varangians under Byzantine generals who were themselves operating across a vast and contested Mediterranean theatre. The empire in the 1030s was aggressive, expansionist in its ambitions, and increasingly focused on a prize that had slipped from Christian hands 2 centuries earlier, Sicily. The island had been under Muslim control since Arab forces completed their conquest in 902, and it sat like a geographic lock across the central Mediterranean, its harbours useful to anyone who held them and dangerous to anyone who didn't. By 1038, Emperor Michael IV had assembled the means and the political will to attempt its reconquest. He gave the command to George Maniakes, a general whose personal size was reportedly so extreme that Byzantine chroniclers felt compelled to remark on it. A man described as standing head and shoulders above the tallest men around him, with a voice like a war trumpet and a temperament to match. Maniakes was brilliant and brutal, the kind of commander who could hold together a genuinely diverse fighting force through sheer force of personality and the credible threat of catastrophic consequence for failure. That force included the Varangian Guard, and Harald commanded its contingent. Alongside him, in one of the more extraordinary coincidences of 11th century Mediterranean history, were Norman mercenaries serving the same Byzantine employer, men like William Iron Arm, himself a future ruler, who would go on to help establish Norman dominance in southern Italy and eventually Sicily itself. For a few years in the late 1030s, Vikings and Normans, two peoples who shared distant Scandinavian ancestry, but had diverged so completely that they would eventually meet on opposite sides of the most consequential invasion in English history, were fighting on the same ground under the same general. The world of the medieval Mediterranean had a talent for these compressions. The Sicilian campaign ran from 1038 into 1040. The sagas characteristically give Harald a starring role, claiming that he personally captured 4 towns on the island, an assertion that Byzantine sources do not confirm with any precision, though they do record Varangian participation in the broader effort. What the sources agree on is that the campaign made significant initial progress. Maniakes' forces pushed the Arab defenders back across the island's northeast, seizing positions around Messina and operating as far south and west as terrain and supply lines allowed. It was grinding, difficult work, siegecraft and direct assault across country that rewarded defenders who knew it and punished attackers who didn't. Harald would have been at the centre of that grinding work. The Varangians in Byzantine service were not strategic advisors or parade ground ornaments. They were the instrument deployed at the hardest moments, as the previous section established. A Sicilian fortified town in 1038 or 1039, with Arab defenders who had held the island for over a century and had no intention of surrendering it, was exactly the kind of problem the Guard existed to solve. Whatever the saga exaggerations, there is nothing implausible about a capable Norse commander accumulating genuine experience and genuine loot during 2 years of active Mediterranean campaigning. Then the complications arrived. The Sicilian campaign stalled politically before it could conclude militarily. Maniakes, by multiple accounts, a man whose genius came packaged with a violent contempt for subordinates who irritated him, quarrelled with the fleet commander and saw Byzantine naval support withdrawn at a critical moment. The reconquest of Sicily, so promising in its early stages, was suspended before completion. Harald and the Varangians were redirected to a new problem in southern Italy, where a Lombard and Norman revolt had broken out against Byzantine authority. The men Harald had fought alongside in Sicily were now, in the reorganised mathematics of Mediterranean politics, fighting against him. The Italian phase was harder. At the Battle of Olivento in March 1041 and the Battle of Montemaggiore in May of the same year, Byzantine forces under the Catapan Michael Dokeanos, with Harald commanding the Varangian contingent, suffered defeats at Norman hands. These were not the overwhelming disasters that the word defeat sometimes implies in medieval chronicles, but they were real reversals, and they illustrated something important about the limits of the Guard's effectiveness. Against Arab defenders behind stone walls, the Varangian axe was decisive. Against Norman cavalry in open field engagements on Italian terrain, the tactical balance shifted. The Guard was formidable under almost any conditions. It was not invincible under all of them. By late 1041 the Varangians were recalled to Constantinople. The Italian campaigns had not been won, but Harald had not been broken by them either. Emperor Michael IV, assessing the service record of this Norse commander who had fought across Sicily, Italy, and also the Bulgarian campaign of 1041, awarded him the Byzantine court rank of Manglabites and later Spatharokandidatos, honours that carried real social weight in a culture where rank was expressed with the precision of an engineering discipline. These were not honorary titles handed out for attendance. They recognised a sustained career of serious military service across multiple fronts. What Harald had accumulated by this point was more than rank. He had spent years in the most sophisticated military system in the medieval world, learning logistics and siegecraft, political navigation, and the management of culturally diverse forces on campaigns that stretched from the Straits of Sicily to the plains of southern Italy. He had also accumulated considerable wealth, gold and loot from years of Byzantine service, which saga accounts describe him shipping to Yaroslav in Kiev for safekeeping, building a war chest that would eventually fund something far more personal than any Byzantine emperor's ambitions. All of this, the hardship, the exile, the years inside an imperial war machine, is where the epithet came from. He did not arrive in history as Harald Hardråde, the hard ruler. That name was earned, and its origins are here, in the burning of Sicilian towns and the difficult retreats through Italian terrain, and the long accumulation of experience that makes a man not just dangerous, but specifically, deliberately, architecturally dangerous. He would leave Constantinople eventually, taking his gold and his reputation north toward a Norwegian throne that was not yet his. But the man who arrived back in the north was not the wounded teenager who had fled Stiklestad in 1030. He had been reshaped by the Mediterranean, by its wars, its wealth, and its demands, in ways that the fjords and the longhouses of his childhood could never have produced. The Guard had taken a prince in exile and returned a ruler in waiting. Harald Hardråde left Constantinople with gold, rank, and a reputation that would follow him all the way to the English coast at Stamford Bridge. But he left something else behind too, something smaller, more permanent, and in many ways more revealing than any saga account of his campaigns. Somewhere in the years he spent inside the city, or in the years of other Norse soldiers who came before and after him, a man named Halfdan picked up something sharp and pressed it into marble. The stone he chose was not random. It was a parapet rail inside Hagia Sophia, the great church that served as the spiritual heart of the Byzantine Empire, the building that a Viking envoy, according to the Russian Primary Chronicle, had once described as so magnificent that visitors could not be certain whether they stood on earth or in heaven. Halfdan walked through that building, looked at that marble, and carved his name into it. Runic letters, in a building that had stood for 5 centuries, in a city that considered itself the centre of the civilized world. The inscription was not rediscovered until 1964, when a scholar examining the parapet realized that the faint marks in the stone were not decorative wear but language. Old Norse, a name, Halfdan. It is, by any measure, an extraordinary object. Not because it is elaborate, it isn't. It is a man's name and nothing more, a piece of personal graffiti pressed into an imperial monument by someone who almost certainly knew exactly where he was, and chose that location anyway, perhaps because of its prestige, perhaps because boredom and a long guard rotation have produced stranger impulses in soldiers throughout history. But it is also contemporaneous, physical evidence of Norse presence in Constantinople at a level that no saga can match. The sagas describe fleets and battles and the movements of great men. Halfdan describes himself, present, in the room. There is a second runic inscription in Hagia Sophia, though it speaks with less clarity. The letters are heavily worn, and scholars have not reached agreement on whether the name reads Ari, Arni, or something else entirely. The uncertainty is characteristic of this kind of evidence. Stone weathers, and what was carved with confidence in the 11th century may survive only partially into the 21st. What the second inscription confirms, regardless of the disputed reading, is that Halfdan was not an anomaly. Norse soldiers moved through that building with enough regularity that marking it became, if not routine, then at least a repeated impulse. They were there. They were there long enough and comfortably enough to leave their names. The Piraeus lion tells a story of a different scale. The lion itself is enormous, 3 meters of ancient Greek marble, originally placed at the entrance to the harbour at Piraeus outside Athens, where it stood for centuries as a monument to the classical world that the Byzantine Empire considered its inheritance. Sometime in the 11th century someone carved into its flanks, not a name scratched in passing, but something far more elaborate, 2 long runic scrolls winding across the stone in the Swedish tradition, their letters cut with enough deliberation that the work must have taken time. Time, presumably, that was available because Norse soldiers were stationed nearby. The lion was eventually taken to Venice, seized by the Doge Francesco Morosini in 1687 during a war with the Ottomans, carried to the city that had replaced Byzantium as the great Mediterranean power, and placed in the arsenal where it still stands today. It was a Swedish scholar, Johann David Åkerblad, who first recognized the runic inscriptions in the late 18th century and identified them as Swedish, the work of men from the same upland heartland that produced so many of the Varangian Guards recruits. Later scholarship, working from the readings established by Eric Breit in the early 20th century, pieced together names from the worn text: Asmund, Ari, Hakon, men who served, who fought, who left a monument inside a monument in a harbour that led to a city they had either visited or helped garrison. The translations remain imperfect. The stone is weathered across 9 centuries of Mediterranean exposure, and the early attempts at reading it, made by scholars working from drawings rather than direct examination, introduced errors that later corrections only partially resolved. What the inscriptions say with confidence is that a group of Swedish warriors who identified themselves as Suia, Swedes, made their marks on a Greek harbour monument during a period when the Varangian Guard was the most prominent Norse institution in the Byzantine world. They were commemorating something, perhaps a leader's death, perhaps a military victory, perhaps simply the fact of their presence in a place so far from the lakes and birch forests of central Sweden that the distance itself must have seemed worth recording. That impulse, to record distance, service, and loss in stone, runs through a third category of evidence that does not come from the Mediterranean at all, but from Sweden itself. Scattered across the provinces of Uppland and Södermanland, roughly 30 runestones survive that mention voyages to Griqualand, Greece, which in the Norse usage of the period meant essentially the Byzantine Empire and its territories. These are the Greece runestones, and they use a vocabulary that has the texture of specialized knowledge. Grikfari, traveller to Greece, Grikafnir, Greek harbours. These are not poetic abstractions. They are the terms of men who made a specific journey to a specific place and needed specific words to describe it. The stones were raised by families. A mother commemorating a son who went south and did not come back. A brother marking the loss of a man who died in service. The grief in them is formulaic by the conventions of runic commemoration, but the geography is precise. Runestone, U170, among the Italy stones, a smaller group of 3 or 4 stones that record deaths in southern Italy, rather than Greece proper, names a man called Balfa, who died with the Greeks in the Italian theatre. That phrase, med Gricium, locates him inside the Byzantine military system at exactly the moment when Varangian forces were campaigning in Apulia and fighting the Normans who had once been their campaign companions in Sicily. The stone in Sweden and the battles in Italy are connected by a man who crossed that distance and paid for it with his life. What these inscriptions collectively produce is something that neither saga literature nor Byzantine chronicle quite achieves. They convert the Viking Mediterranean into personal human experience. Hagia Sophia gives us Halfdan, not the Guard, not the Rus, not the Norse presence in Byzantium as a geopolitical fact, but a man, present, with a name. The Piraeus lion gives us Asmund and Hakon, and the Suia, a group of specific Swedes in a specific harbour. The rune stones give us Balfur, and the unnamed sons and brothers whose families carried the loss home to Uppland and paid a carver to put it in stone. The challenge, and it is a genuine one, is in deciding where evidence ends and legend begins. The sagas that describe Harald Hardråde's Sicilian victories in grandiose terms cannot be taken at face value without Byzantine corroboration, and that corroboration is partial at best. The 907 Constantinople raid may be a later invention to explain trade treaties. Fleet sizes across the entire period are almost certainly exaggerated by the sources that recorded them. The runic inscriptions do not exaggerate. They do not claim victories or enumerate ships. They record names and deaths, and the fact of having been somewhere. Halfdan was in Hagia Sophia. Balfa died in Italy with the Greeks. Hakon's name is on a harbour lion in a city that no longer exists under that name. In the gap between what the sagas claim and what the stones confirm, there is a real history, more complicated, more human, and in its way more astonishing than the legend. A teenager from Sweden pressing his name into the marble of the greatest building in the world. A group of warriors marking a Greek lion before it stood in a Venetian arsenal for centuries, waiting for someone to recognise the letters. Families in Södermanland learning that the South had kept the men they sent to it. These are the traces of a movement that changed everyone it touched, and they are more durable than any chronicle. Stone outlasts the men who carve it, and the names they leave behind outlast the empires they served. The names carved into Hagia Sophia and the Lions of Piraeus belong to men who arrived in the Byzantine world as mercenaries, drawn south by the promise of pay, glory, and a place inside the greatest military machine of the medieval Mediterranean. They went because the guard was there, because the route was established, because the infrastructure of varangian service made the journey thinkable. But in 1107 something different happened. A king left Norway with a fleet and a crusader's cross, and sailed the entire length of the known world, not because he was hired, but because he chose to go. His name was Sigurd, son of Magnus Barefoot, and he was barely 20 years old when he set out. History would give him an epithet that compressed his entire legacy into 4 syllables: Jorsalfare, the Jerusalem farer. The expedition he led was the first Christian crusade undertaken by a Scandinavian monarch, and by any reasonable measure it was also one of the most audacious sea voyages of the medieval period. The fleet that left Norway in the autumn of 1107 numbered around 60 ships. Some chronicles call them galleys, though the distinction between Scandinavian longships and Mediterranean galleys was less clean in this period than it might seem, and carried somewhere in the range of 5,000 men, though that figure, drawn from saga sources, should be understood as an approximation rather than a census. They were warriors, sailors, and clergy. They were crusaders, and they were also, unmistakably, Vikings. What made Sigurd's voyage so striking was precisely that it was both of those things at once. The fleet spent its first winter in England, a practical stop that also carried its own symbolic weight. England was, after all, the country that Sigurd's own grandfather Harald Hardråde had tried and failed to conquer 40 years earlier at Stamford Bridge. From there, in the spring of 1108, the ships turned south and followed the Atlantic coast of Iberia, in a passage that quickly became something more than a transit. Along the Portuguese and Galician coasts, the Norwegians fought. They seized Saracen galleys operating off the shore, they stormed a castle at Sintra, they fought at Alcacer do Sal, the kind of engagement that crusading ideology framed as holy warfare, and that Viking tradition framed as simply what a fleet did when it encountered resistance. It was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself across the entire voyage. Each stop on the maritime arc between Norway and Jerusalem became both a stage of the journey and an event in its own right, a small campaign folded into a larger one. The pilgrimage and the raid were not intention. In Sigurd's world they were the same gesture. Entering the Mediterranean through the Strait of Gibraltar in early 1109, the fleet turned east into the inland sea that Scandinavians had been reaching by effort and ingenuity for over 2 centuries. But where Björn Ironside had crossed that threshold as a raider in the 9th century, a stranger arriving violently in a world he was encountering for the first time, Sigurd entered it as a known quantity. The Mediterranean's political map had been reshuffled by the First Crusade only a decade earlier, and the Norwegians moved through it with a kind of confident legibility, reading coastlines and stopping at islands where enemies could be fought and treasure could be taken. The Balearic Islands provided both. At Formentera, Ibiza and Minorca, the fleet encountered Muslim-held territories and attacked them, the engagements producing what the sagas describe as significant plunder and the kind of close-quarters ship-to-ship fighting that Norwegian crews had been training for since childhood. These were not the hesitant raids of men uncertain of their footing. They were the actions of a force that knew exactly what it was doing, pressing through the Mediterranean the same way their ancestors had pressed through the rivers of the Rus, with violence as the instrument of passage. Then came Sicily. The Norwegians arrived on the island in the spring of 1109 and were met by a young count named Roger II, who was perhaps 15 or 16 years old at the time, a Norman ruler on a Norman-held island in the middle of a sea that his ancestors had arrived in as mercenary warriors, not so different from the men now standing on his shore. Saga accounts describe the reception as generous, with gifts exchanged and hospitality extended. Sicily served as a wintering ground, a staging point, a place to repair ships and resupply. How formal or how extensive the relationship between Sigurd and Roger actually was is not fully documented. The sources are fragmentary, and the diplomatic weight of the meeting is hard to assess, but the symbolic resonance was real. 2 dynasties with Scandinavian roots, meeting on an island that Vikings had first reached by sea in 860, now in conversation as Christian rulers operating within the framework of crusading Europe. The contrast with that earlier raid is worth pausing on. When Björn Ironside's fleet struck Sicily from the sea, they were strangers to the Mediterranean world, fearsome, unprecedented, impossible to place within any existing framework of politics or religion. In 1109, a Norwegian king arrived on the same island and was welcomed by its ruler. The world had turned, and the turning was in no small part because of everything that had happened in between. The Varangian Guard, the Rus trade routes, the Norse soldiers who had served Byzantine emperors and returned home with gold and Greek words and an understanding of how power worked in the south. Sigurd was the heir to all of that. By the summer of 1110 the fleet had crossed the eastern Mediterranean and reached the coast of the Holy Land, making landfall at Acre, or possibly Jaffa. The sources differ slightly on the detail. King Baldwin I of Jerusalem rode out to meet them. The crusading state that had been carved out of the Levant by the First Crusade was still fragile, its borders contested and its grip on the coast uncertain. Sigurd's fleet represented something genuinely useful. Northern warriors with ships, battle experience, and a religious mandate to fight. Together, the Norwegians and the Crusaders attacked Sidon, the coastal city whose fall would help consolidate the Crusader position on the Lebanese shore. The city fell. Baldwin presented Sigurd with relics, a splinter of wood said to have come from the True Cross, one of the most consequential objects in medieval Christendom. And Sigurd carried it home, eventually depositing it at the church in Kongsberg as a physical proof of where he had been and what he had done. From Jerusalem the fleet sailed to Constantinople. The city received Sigurd the way it had received so many Norse travellers before him, with a mixture of ceremonial grandeur and shrewd calculation. Emperor Alexios I. Komnenos honoured the Norwegian king with gifts and celebrations, the machinery of Byzantine imperial hospitality running as smoothly as it had when it first processed Varangian mercenaries a century earlier. Many of Sigurd's men never left. They joined the Varangian Guard, slipping into the institution that had been absorbing Scandinavian warriors for over 100 years. Their Norwegian names added to the roles of an elite unit that was by this point as much a Scandinavian tradition as a Byzantine one. Sigurd gave the fleet itself to the emperor, 60 ships, a gesture that was part gift, part tribute, and part acknowledgement that he no longer needed them for the journey home. He returned to Norway overland in 1111, crossing through the Balkans and Central Europe, the sea voyage behind him but its weight permanent. What Sigurd had completed was not simply a crusade. It was a maritime pilgrimage on a scale that no Scandinavian had attempted before him, a voyage that moved through every major theatre of Viking Mediterranean history in a single coherent arc. The same coast that Björn Ironside had raided, the same island that Varangians had reconquered, the same city that Norse warriors had attacked and served and inscribed for 2.5 centuries. Sigurd passed through all of it, and where his ancestors had arrived as threats or mercenaries, he arrived as a king. What happened after Sigurd left Constantinople tells you almost everything about what that city had become for the Norse world over the preceding 2 centuries. He arrived home in Norway in 1111 with fewer than 100 men. He had left with somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000. The rest had died along the way, in harbour skirmishes off Iberia, in the island fights of the Balearics, in the siege trenches at Sidon, or they had simply stayed. Most of those who stayed remained in Constantinople, absorbed into the Varangian Guard the way a river is absorbed into the sea, carrying their crusading experience into the ranks of an institution that had been built precisely to receive men like them. Norse warriors who had prayed at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and fought under a crusader's banner now stood watch in the corridors of the Byzantine imperial palace, trading their Norwegian vows for Greek commands and their homeland winters for the mild seasons of the Bosporus. The Guard had always been a crossroads. After Sigurd's crusade, it became something slightly more than that, a final destination for northern men who had already reached the edge of the world and decided there was nothing left to sail back for. Constantinople itself occupied a peculiar and irreplaceable position in the imaginative geography of the Norse world. The sagas called it Miklagard, the Great City, and that name carried a weight that no straightforward translation can fully capture. It was not simply large. It was the largest thing that most medieval Scandinavians could conceive of, a city whose walls enclosed more people than many entire Norwegian river valleys, whose churches contained gold enough to buy kingdoms, whose harbour received ships from every direction of the compass at once. To reach Miklagard was, in the Norse imagination, something close to reaching the centre of the world. And for the men who came back from Sigurd's crusade and chose to remain inside it, that centre was also a kind of ending, the point beyond which there was nowhere further to go. But Constantinople was not only a destination, it was a crossing point, and the two functions coexisted without contradiction. For the warriors who did return north with Sigurd, those fewer than 100 men who retraced the overland Balkan route through Serbia and Hungary, and eventually back to Scandinavia, the city had served as a gateway in both directions. They had come through it on the way south and now passed through it again on the way home, carrying with them the relic of the true cross, the memory of the Sidon siege, and an understanding of the Byzantine world that no amount of saga reading could have produced. Constantinople was where you arrived and where you departed, depending on the direction of travel. That doubleness is what made it so central to Viking Mediterranean history from the very beginning. Think about the arc of that history and how consistently the city appears at its turning points. In 860, Norse warriors sailed from the Black Sea into the Bosporus and laid siege to it, failing to breach walls that were at that moment one of the most formidable structures in the known world. In 988, the emperor of those same walls invited 6,000 Scandinavian soldiers to come and defend them, transforming the relationship between Norse violence and Byzantine power in a single diplomatic stroke. Harald Hardråde served inside those walls as a young man and left wealthy and famous, carrying Greek gold back to Norway and eventually to a doomed invasion of England. Runes were carved into the marble of the greatest church in Christendom, casual acts of inscription that somehow survived the centuries and now stare back at tourists who may not know what they are looking at. And then Sigurd arrived with 60 ships, gave them all to the emperor, and sailed away in the knowledge that thousands of his men would remain. What this sustained engagement between the Norse world and Constantinople meant in practical terms was a kind of slow civilizational conversation that neither side fully articulated, but both sides clearly felt. The Varangian Guard was its most visible expression, an institution that required Norse warriors to know Byzantine military protocols, Byzantine religious ceremonial, Byzantine Greek, and Byzantine court hierarchy, while simultaneously allowing them to maintain their own identity, their own language among themselves, their own drinking customs that the Greeks found alarming and somehow endearing. Men went into the Guard as Norwegians or Swedes or Rus, and came out as something more complicated, carrying two worlds simultaneously, and when they returned north, if they returned north, they brought that complexity with them. Sigurd's voyage deepened those ties in ways that went beyond the merely personal. The gift of 60 ships to Alexios I Komnenos was not a random gesture of generosity. It was a diplomatic act that formalized the relationship between Norway and Byzantium at the level of heads of state, acknowledging that the two realms had enough shared interest to warrant a direct alliance. Norway and the Byzantine Empire were not neighbours. They had no common border, no shared language, no intertwined dynastic bloodlines in the way that Western European kingdoms did. What they had was 2.5 centuries of contact through warriors, merchants and river routes, and Sigurd's crusade converted that informal network into something that looked, at least briefly, like actual international diplomacy. His later marriage to Malmfrid, daughter of Mstislav I of Kiev, who was himself a key Byzantine ally, drew those threads tighter still. Norway sat at one end of the line, Constantinople sat at the other, and the line ran through every runic inscription, every grave mound, every ship given, and every warrior absorbed along the way. For the wider Christian world, the implications of what Sigurd had done were also significant in ways that contemporaries recognized even if they could not fully articulate them. The First Crusade had established the Crusader states in the Levant, but those states were perpetually short of men and ships. Sigurd had demonstrated that the Norse world could contribute to their defence, that the same maritime tradition which had sent longships up the Seine and the Thames could be redirected toward the coasts of the Holy Land, deploying Scandinavian seamanship in the service of Christian geopolitics. The siege of Sidon was not a major event in the grand narrative of the Crusades, but it was real, and the fleet that made it possible had come from Norway. The Christian East and the Norse North were now, in some meaningful sense, part of the same project. All of this, the Guard, the Crusade, the Relic, the gift of ships, the men who stayed and the men who came home, forms the connective tissue of a relationship that lasted for generations and left marks on both ends. The runestones that stand in Swedish fields, weathered now and hard to read, commemorate men who went to Greece and never returned. The carvings in Hagia Sophia, scratched into marble by soldiers who were probably bored during a long ceremony and certainly not thinking about posterity, outlasted the Byzantine Empire itself. The ships Sigurd gave to Constantinople are long gone. Their timber rotted into the sediment of the Bosporus, but what they represented, the willingness of a Norse king to make a gesture so large that it required giving away his fleet, still resonates if you know where to look. The road back through Constantinople was also, always, a road forward. Forward into Byzantine service, into the crusading world, into the slow process by which the Vikings were transformed by everything they encountered in the south. That transformation is what the rest of this story is really about. The transformation the previous section describes did not happen all at once, and it did not happen in only one direction. The Mediterranean changed the Vikings, but the Vikings also left something of themselves inside the Mediterranean world that neither time nor conquest has entirely erased. Start with what the Norse world actually was before these southern voyages began in earnest. Scandinavia, in the 8th and 9th centuries, was a maritime culture oriented toward coasts, rivers, and the open northern sea. Its warriors understood raid economics. Move fast, strike hard, carry off what you can before resistance organizes. Its merchants understood that silver moved wherever there was demand, and that the man with the fastest ship set the terms of exchange. Both of these orientations were genuine and effective within the world that had produced them, but they were also limited by that world. The Mediterranean did not merely extend those instincts, it complicated them, challenged them, and eventually replaced several of them with something more elaborate. The first complication was economic. When Norse traders and raiders pushed south through the river systems of Eastern Europe and reached the Black Sea, they encountered two of the wealthiest commercial civilizations on Earth operating simultaneously, the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate. Both ran on currencies of extraordinary quality and both produced luxury goods: Byzantine silk, Islamic silver dirhams, wine, olive oil, spices, that Scandinavian home markets had never seen and immediately wanted. The Spillings hoard, discovered on the Swedish island of Gotland and containing nearly 14,000 Islamic coins and 67 kilograms of silver, gives you the scale of what came north through those river routes. That is not the residue of a single raid. It is the accumulated evidence of sustained commercial engagement, of men who learned to trade as fluently as they raided, and who understood that the Islamic and Byzantine worlds would keep producing silver and silk indefinitely, which meant the smarter strategy was access rather than seizure. The second complication was political. The assault on Constantinople in 860 produced no permanent Viking occupation of the city. Neither did the catastrophic attempt of 941, broken apart by Greek fire in the harbour of the Bosporus. What those confrontations produced instead was negotiation, trade treaties, agreements about Norse merchants operating within Byzantine territory, and eventually the formal diplomatic exchange of 988, in which Emperor Basil II secured 6,000 Rus warriors from Vladimir I of Kiev in return for a marriage alliance that gave Vladimir the emperor's own sister. The men who had come as raiders became, through the mechanisms of Byzantine statecraft, the Varangian Guard. That shift from enemy at the gate to soldier inside the palace is one of the more remarkable diplomatic reversals in medieval history, and it could only have happened because both sides had already spent decades learning how the other operated. What the Varangian Guard then did to those men who entered it was gradual and profound. A Norse warrior who arrived in Constantinople speaking Old Norse and knowing nothing beyond Scandinavian geography left the Guard, if he left at all, knowing Byzantine Greek well enough to take military orders in it, familiar with Orthodox Christian ceremony, acquainted with the administrative logic of an empire that stretched from the Balkans to Anatolia, and possessed of campaign experience that ranged across Sicily, southern Italy, the Levant and the Adriatic. Harald Hardråde went into Byzantine service as a young man of modest means and emerged wealthy enough to claim a throne, carrying with him not only Byzantine gold, but a strategic sophistication that the purely Norse martial tradition could not have produced on its own. His later campaigns in England showed both the ambition and the organisational competence of a man who had learned war in the Eastern Mediterranean and applied those lessons elsewhere. The Sicilian campaigns of 1038 extended this transformation into the central Mediterranean. When Varangians fought alongside the Byzantine general George Maniakes in the partial reconquest of Sicily from Arab control, they were no longer the raiders who had struck that same island's coastlines back in the 9th century under Björn Ironside. They were professional soldiers operating within a structured imperial military system, fighting for Byzantine strategic objectives, and functioning as part of a multinational force that included Normans, Lombards, and Greeks alongside Norsemen. The distance between those two Sicilian moments, the raid fleet of around 200 longships in 860 and the varangian contingent of 1038, measures the distance the Viking world had travelled in less than 2 centuries. Then there is the matter of Jerusalem. When Sigurd I sailed from Norway in 1107 with 60 ships and roughly 5,000 men, he was participating in a structure, the crusading movement, that was itself a product of the contact between northern European Christianity and the Mediterranean world. His voyage took him through Iberia, the Balearics and Sicily before reaching the Levant, threading together almost every site where Norse and Mediterranean history had previously intersected. At Sidon, his fleet contributed to an actual crusader military operation. In Constantinople afterward, the gift of his ships to Emperor Alexios I formalised Norwegian participation in Byzantine geopolitics at the highest diplomatic level. The men who remained in the Varangian Guard after Sigurd departed carried both experiences simultaneously, crusaders and imperial soldiers at once, northern men who had remade themselves into something the purely Norse tradition had no category for. The physical evidence of all of this change is scattered across a wide geography and a wide range of materials. Runestones in Sweden and Norway commemorate men who went to Greece and Italy and did not return, raising the question of what those men encountered, absorbed, and became before they died far from the Baltic. The runic scratches in the marble of Hagia Sophia, left there by Varangian soldiers during ceremonies they may have found interminable, show men asserting their identity inside the grandest building in Christendom, insisting on being legible as Norse even while serving a Greek emperor in an Orthodox Christian ritual context. The Piraeus lion, its flank carved with runic text by warriors, whose names we can almost but not quite recover, travelled from its original Greek harbour to Venice, where it still stands, a Norse inscription embedded in a Greek artefact displaced into an Italian city, which is itself a fairly accurate metaphor for the entire Mediterranean chapter of Viking history. What the Mediterranean ultimately gave the Vikings was scale, not only geographic scale, though the routes from Norway to Jerusalem are vast enough, but conceptual scale. Contact with Byzantium and the Islamic world expanded what Scandinavian warriors and merchants understood about power, wealth, diplomacy, religion, and the organisation of large human enterprises. The stereotype of the northern coastal raider, accurate enough for one phase of Norse activity, cannot contain what the Varangian Guard was, or what Sigurd's crusade represented, or what the Spillings Hoard implies about generations of commercial exchange. The Mediterranean did not simply give the Vikings new places to go. It gave them new ways of being in the world, new vocabularies of ambition and belonging, new possibilities that the Baltic and the North Sea had not offered and could not have offered. The routes they travelled to reach all of this, down the Dnieper, across the Black Sea, through the Bosporus, along the Aegean, around the Peloponnese, west to Sicily and south to the Levant, became, over 2.5 centuries, something more than trade and raid corridors. They became the channels through which the Norse world connected itself to the larger medieval world, to its conflicts and its commerce and its faith and its catastrophes. The Vikings who followed those routes went south as one kind of people and came back, when they came back at all, as another. So how did they do it? How did people from the fjords and frozen coastlines of the north reach Sicily, Constantinople, and the walls of Jerusalem? The answer is not a single one. It was ships, light enough to be carried overland, shallow enough to navigate rivers no warship had any business travelling, seaworthy enough to cross open water from the Baltic to the Aegean. It was rivers. The Dnieper and the Volga threading down through the forests of Eastern Europe to the Black Sea, turning the interior of a continent into a highway. It was alliances, struck first by necessity and then by preference, with Byzantine emperors who understood that the most dangerous men outside the palace walls were also the most useful men inside them. And it was imperial service, the Varangian Guard, that extraordinary institution that gave thousands of Norse warriors a permanent address in the most powerful city on earth and campaign experience across the entire eastern Mediterranean basin. Each of those mechanisms fed the others. The rivers brought the first rustraders and raiders to the Black Sea. The raids on Constantinople produced, through the logic of Byzantine diplomacy, the treaties that opened the city to Norse merchants. The merchants became soldiers. the soldiers became guardsmen. The guardsmen fought in Sicily and southern Italy and the Levant, and some of them came home carrying Byzantine gold and Orthodox Christian influence, and memories of a world that Scandinavia had never imagined from within itself. Sigurd Jorsalfar's crusade in 1107 was the fullest expression of all these mechanisms working simultaneously. 60 ships, roughly 5,000 men, a route that passed through every major node of Viking Mediterranean history before arriving at Jerusalem itself. When his warriors stopped in Constantinople on the way home, and many of them stayed, joining the guard that had been drawing Norsemen southward for more than a century, the circle closed in a way that felt, even at the time, like something that had been a long time arriving. Sicily, Constantinople, and the Holy Land occupied a particular space in the Norse imagination that went beyond military or commercial calculation. Miklagård, the great city, was not just a trading partner or an employer. It was the summit of the known world, the place where wealth accumulated in quantities that strained description, where the emperor sat beneath golden ceilings and commanded armies drawn from every nation. For a culture that measured status in ships and silver and the willingness to travel farther than anyone else had travelled, Constantinople was the ultimate destination. The raiders who attacked it in 860 were not simply after plunder. They were announcing their presence to the centre of the medieval world, and the men who eventually served inside it were not simply mercenaries. They were participants in something larger than the Norse world had previously offered them. The difficulty with this history is that it moves across the boundary between evidence and legend with uncomfortable frequency. The 907 raid on Constantinople, with its dramatic detail of ships hauled overland to bypass the harbour chain, appears in the sagas but nowhere in Byzantine records, and scholars remain genuinely divided about whether it happened at all or was constructed later to explain the trade treaties that followed. Fleet sizes for the 860 Sicily expedition vary so widely between sources that the figure of around 200 ships and some 20,000 warriors should be held lightly, as a rough order of magnitude rather than a census. The saga tradition was not interested in the same kind of precision that modern historians require, and the line between what Björn Ironside actually did and what later poets needed him to have done is not always recoverable. What survives the uncertainty, what cuts through the legend and the saga embellishment and the lost records, is stone, marble specifically. The name Halfdan scratched into a parapet inside Hagia Sophia by a varangian soldier, who may have found the ceremony around him too long to endure in silence. The runic inscriptions covering the flank of the Piraeus lion, carved by Swedish warriors into a Greek harbour monument sometime in the 11th century, a monument that was later seized by Venice and carried to the arsenal, where it still stands. A Norse text in a Greek body in an Italian city, which is the entire Mediterranean chapter of Viking history compressed into a single object. 30 or so runestones in Sweden commemorating men who went to Gricium, to the land of the Greeks, and did not return. 4 more marking those who died in Langbadaland, the Viking name for southern Italy. Those inscriptions are not romantic. They are mundane, in the way that all surviving personal evidence eventually is: names, places, the fact of a death far from home. But that mundanity is precisely what makes them powerful. They are proof that real people with names and families who missed them enough to raise stone in their memory travelled from the Baltic to the Bosporus and to the coasts of Sicily and to the harbour approaches of Jerusalem. They built no empire in the Mediterranean. They left no lasting political structure with a Norse name. What they left was this: scratches in marble, carvings on lion flanks, runestones facing the Swedish sky, and the faint trace of a vast maritime world that reached further south than anyone who had not seen it would have believed possible.